I want to share with you two of the pleasures of what it's like to facilitate a colloquium. After all, it's a very busy weekend. There are events after events after events. There's shooing people out and shooing people in, and shooing people in and shooing people in. We have the graduation of leaders not only from Israel, of course, but also from our North American program. And I'd like to ask those leaders to stand up as well. Lois Alpern and Harold Blonder and Peter Gilbert, if they are here. There's Lois in the back. And Harold, wonderful. But it isn't all work. There's also gratification. And there are two special pleasures I want to share with you. The first is that I get an opportunity to watch the panelists' faces during the other speeches at very close proximity. And sometimes they're very interested. Sometimes you can see that they're thinking and they write something down to save for later. And sometimes they get this look as if they don't know where this person came from and where this idea landed from. And I remember when I would give sermons here at the Birmingham Temple, we had a member at the time whose name was Charlotte Nelson, and whenever she listened, she would have this look on her face like this. And I asked her finally, "Do you not understand what I'm saying?" And she said, "No, I'm concentrating. That's how I concentrate." It made things so much easier for me because I thought she's a clear thinker, and if I kept trying to say it clearer and clearer and clearer, and she kept looking like this, and I thought, what am I going to do? So that's one pleasure, is seeing the speakers' faces. But the second pleasure is this moment, the last session, because we've had all of these great ideas, hour upon hour, and words upon words, and then I get to stand up, share all of these great ideas, and then I sound brilliant. Simply by telling you these ideas in my own words. Now, when I was in Sherwin's confirmation class in high school, which was taught in the library right across the way, and if you're looking for the Torah, that's where you'll find it, he would ask us a question, and half of the time no one knew what he wanted for the answer, but sometimes one of us got close, and then I could take that answer and put it in the words that Sherwin wanted, and then that was the right answer. And so from time to time, these closing sessions would be putting it in Sherwin's phrasing and Sherwin's framing and Sherwin's understanding, which helped us understand in our own way. In fact, hearing something twice in two different ways gives us double the opportunity to internalize it. Now, we are facing Jews in the Muslim world, solving the puzzle. And you've seen in your brochures the logo that we've used, this design of a crossword puzzle with the words intersecting. Now, I do crossword puzzles from time to time, and there are plenty of times where I don't get every single square. There's some obscure question about a ballerina in 1925 in the Bolshoi, and I just don't know it. And that's okay. It's okay not to get the little tiny details. If you get the big parts of the puzzle and you feel like you've made progress, you've gotten the joke or the pun, you feel like you've made something out of it. And I think that in many ways it's a marvelous metaphor for our colloquium. We're trying to solve the puzzle, to get the big pieces. And we may not fill in every detail, put every last letter in. But what we want to try and find is, in a way, what we can contribute to this Christian, Jewish, and Muslim dialogue in facing the West and the challenge of radical Islam. And I was thinking, as I did an anticipatory program for this last week, what contribution can secular and humanistic Jews have to a dialogue with Muslims? After all, mainstream Islam is relatively traditional, and it has a lot of commonalities with Orthodox Judaism. How many times a day do you pray? 5 times or 3 times? How do you treat your venerated sacred scripture, the Torah or the Quran? What kind of dietary laws do you practice? What is your one-line statement of faith, the Shema or the Shahada? And so on and so on. All of these parallels. And yet, all of those items I mentioned are things that we don't share with Orthodox Judaism. We don't use the traditional Shema. We don't keep a kosher law. We don't venerate the scripture in the same way. We don't pray multiple times a day. We're lucky if you come 1 time a year. So the point is, what contribution can we provide? And as I go through what we've learned this weekend, I'm going to highlight for you how our message came out of our speakers' mouths in different words, but in many ways highlights what we can bring to bear on this dialogue, the message that we can provide to bring the dialogue forward and to resolve some of the differences. So in our crossword puzzle, we began with one across, Yaakov Malkin. And he provided a marvelous tribute to Sherwin Wine through a celebration of the phenomenon of apikorsut, of heresy, but a kind of creative heresy. In fact, you could almost call it the joy of heresy. The enjoyment of being free, free to pursue your happiness, free for other people to pursue theirs. He recalled a moment in history under the Abbasid Empire where minds were opened just enough for an apikoros of the second generation, not Elisha ben Avuya of the days of the Mishnah, but Chiwi al-Balchi, to write his heresy, his heretical 200 Theses. And that heresy became so famous that he had to be condemned by the chief rabbi of his day, Sadia Gaon, a marvelous parallel to the ordination of our Israeli rabbis, who were also condemned by the chief rabbi of their day. And yet, we have to recognize that over the course of Jewish history, Jewish life has been much more structured around Sadia Gaon than Chiwi al-Balchi. We are the minority tradition in that, even if today we are the majority of the way people practice their identity. But what we really come down to out of Yaakov Malkin's speech is the root of this idea of heresy. We think of heresy as breaking from a religious tradition, but the Latin root is heresia, to choose. That the heretic was the one who could choose from the past and for the future, what direction he or she would go. And in many ways, heresia, choice, is the hallmark of modern life, of Western life, and indeed of all liberal religions, even those based on our own beliefs in ourselves and in other people. So what lesson from our philosophy comes out of Professor Malkin's talk that can contribute to this dialogue? Well, it's the importance of freedom of choice, the freedom to believe or not to believe in whatever you choose, as long as you can live together. And that moment in time when the Mu'tazila would study Aristotelian philosophy, and Sadia Gaon would read what they were writing in Arabic, and Maimonides would read Aristotle and Ibn Sina, and it was an interaction of ideas. They could agree to disagree, but that freedom of choice, in whatever constraints it had, is the ideology and the belief that we bring to bear that can contribute to dialogue. And then we turn to Fawaz Girgis, who at this moment is in the Middle East, contributing to interreligious dialogue. He discussed the clash between our modern life of choice and abundance, and he talked to us coming out of the Muslim world. In fact, he has explored those dark corners of Islamic extremism that we as liberal American Jews without Arabic or even the ability to pass in that world, we would never be able to see. He's two down. If Yaakov Malkin is one across, Fawaz Girgis is two down, because he discussed the broken Middle East in a way emblematic of the Muslim world. Consider a broken pane of glass. There is not simply one line most of the time. If a rock hits a glass, it shatters in many directions. And there are many lines and many cracks. And it distorts in both directions. If we consider ourselves on one side and the Muslim world on the other, them looking out, it's distorted because of that pain of shattering, those multiple lines of fracture. But for us looking in, it is also a distorted view. He spoke about the social and economic divisions and dislocations, the tremendous poverty of 2 million people living in cemeteries compared to the consumer culture which demands a cell phone for every hip individual. In fact, he described this gap between rich and poor as a basic failure of governments to, as he put it, deliver the goods. And the failed state is bad for the Jews because the alternative is the Islamist, as we saw with the election of Hamas, and as we see in the abiding popularity of Islamic movements. He talked about the Shia and the Sunni split, and he highlighted for us the fact that it's not only an Iraqi problem. It indeed spreads around the Persian Gulf and even into other countries, even into Egypt, where there is almost no Sunni and Shia split, because there are almost no Shia. But as we heard from Professor Bauer, if you can have anti-Semitism without Jews, you can have fear of the Shia without Shia. But even more important for us is this new idea that Professor Jirji said has gained currency from the radicals into the mainstream. And this is the idea of a combined United States and Zionist and Shia plot to undermine the stability of the Sunni Arab world. And that's why it affects us. Because when these radical ideas become mainstream, that's when the danger becomes real. And he spoke of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which has come up. It was not the core focus of this colloquium, but it has come up again and again for obvious reasons. He said that the Israeli-Palestinian issue was key to the conflict for two reasons. The first is it's the cause célèbre. It's what everybody knows. It's what everybody pays attention to. But also, it's a test of our rhetoric. Do we really mean what we say? If we say have an election, what do we do next? And if we are promoting democracy, do we continue to support Mubarak and other dictators against the will of the people? Because perhaps the will of the people is worse. This is the Scylla and Charybdis that we're really facing. But most importantly, the reason why Israel and Palestinian issue is key for him, talking to an American audience, is that it's the one that we can most affect. We can't get involved and solve the Shia and Sunni dialogue issue. In some ways, we can't directly affect the economic standing of the people in those countries. We can try. We can provide development aid if they'll take it. We can't go into the schools in our language, as Professor Bauer said, and teach John Stuart Mill. That's not going to work. But we can try to affect this intransigent issue of the Israeli and the Palestinian conflict, and not in the 8th year of a presidency, 2 presidencies in a row. He said in conclusion, you spend $500 billion in Iraq, he'll take $100 billion for development of the groundwork, the basis of a civil society. Now, what lesson did we derive? What can we say that relates to that? Well, it's very simple. In secular humanistic Judaism, philosophically, but also ethically, we focus on what we can do, on what we can know. Not on what we can't do, not on the unknowable, the perfect, the unattainable, but the tangible, the real, the here. So we can't change everything, fix every pane of glass. You know, in some universities on the East Coast, they wanted the windows to look old. And so they made perfect windows and intentionally broke them and re-leaded them so they looked like the windows at Cambridge and Oxford. And they treated the roofs with chemicals to make them look older. Of course, it also made them break down faster. And then, of course, they had to replace them, and it created its own problems. But you can see that in fixing the glass, we have to take it one step at a time. One pane, one crack, one step. What we can do and what we can know. We came back revived and refreshed on Saturday morning. And Jacob Lassner presented us with the importance of words, vocabulary, and language. Both the words in the narratives of the Quran and also in the teachings and the language of the Hadith, the traditions around the Quran, the traditions of the deeds of Muhammad and his fellows. And he also explored with us in great detail the importance of a term like tolerance and the multiple words in Arabic that get around it but aren't quite there. Now, I have no Arabic. I mentioned that my grandparents were born in Syria, but in some ways it's a very typical story of the immigrants. The grandparents speak the language, the next generation understands it but doesn't speak it, and at my point I know some words. And I can have a decent accent if somebody writes it out for me. But that's it. I don't have that access to it. And I'm fascinated by the range of meaning of the words for tolerance. I won't pretend to pronounce them. All those variations from absorbing an annoyance, like tolerating a fly, or bearing a burden, like tolerating an obligation, but also the newer interpretations of lightening the load and finding a relaxed way to simply let things happen. In many ways, this describes the ancient world's concept of what it meant to have multiple religions. You see, we think of the word pluralism as emblematic of having multiple religions, but in fact, pluralism is something different. What happened in the ancient world was much better articulated by plurality. There were many options, but they didn't necessarily agree with each other or even find a common ground on which to speak, and they certainly didn't believe that each was an equally valid alternative to the other. And they certainly didn't believe that there was a value in having all of these different options. You see, that's pluralism. That's a belief in there being multiple options. A plurality is better than anarchy and civil war, but it's not modern pluralism. It's also the difference, as Professor Bauer highlighted again today, between toleration and respect. Professor Lassner also highlighted the fundamental issue that Professor Gerber also covered between rhetoric and actions. See, the rhetoric in the Muslim world, as Professor Lassner explained so ably, is negative. The epithets, the accusations, and even the tolerance of there is no coercion in religion, and you have your religion and I have mine, even that's qualified by later statements. And this is despite the actual historical experience. If you wanted a rival to Islam, it was not Christianity. It's the elephant and the squirrel again. But it's the elephant that seems afraid and angry at the squirrel. But when you look at the actions, it doesn't match the rhetoric, because it's a mix. There are persecutions and there are episodic massacres, but by and large, the Jews were considered as natives. Nothing like the sense of the other, the foreigner, the expellable body, as you have in Christianity. And certainly no coercion to conversion, as we heard from both speakers. Now again, for this three across, for Jacob Lassner, another big piece of the puzzle. The first statement of ours is that words have meaning. It matters what you say, because you want to say what you believe, and believe what you say, and the more you say something, the more likely you are to believe it. And most importantly, words have meaning, and if you don't agree with the words, you have to challenge them. If you don't agree with the statements on how to treat unbelievers, then you have to face that. And it's okay to say, you know what, I don't agree. This is in my tradition, it's part of my ancestral heritage, and yet I don't agree. And this is the second lesson. We, in humanistic Judaism, in secular humanistic Judaism, in cultural Judaism, in Israeli Judaism, we have the courage to choose from our inheritance. After all, the Bible is a mix, good things and bad things. I began my comments on Sherwin by citing the Mishnah. That doesn't mean I endorse the entire Mishnah. There are plenty of other passages that I would object to. But after all, our tradition was created by human beings, and it's only understandable that we will agree and disagree. You know, they say it's 2 Jews and 3 opinions. It's 2 people and 3 opinions. Because we argue, and we argue with ourselves. And we argue back and forth, and we argue between groups. There's always going to be a mix. We're always going to change our ideas. We're always going to be imperfect. Beware utopia. Now, after 3 across comes 4 down for Jane Gerber. And she gave us the Jewish side of this encounter in the first millennium with Islam. She highlighted for us the crucial question of who's writing the history and why are they writing the history. And she gave that great example of Heinrich Gretz arguing for Jewish emancipation in the 19th century by not fully creating a myth, but certainly gilding the edges of the golden age of Spain. In fact, the real story is both the lachrymose, the crying version of Jewish history, or as a professor of mine called it, the oy vey view of Jewish history, where you were in one place and they suffered and oy vey and we had to leave and went somewhere else. And oy vey, the fancy term is the lachrymose, the crying view of Jewish history, and the golden age. And in fact, the reality is between the two. She also talked about this difference between theory and practice, that, as she put it, the practice may have been worse in Christianity than the theory, but the theory may have been worse in Islam than the practice. And she spoke about the bargain of being a dhimmi, a tolerated minority, that it was a bargain. You had humiliation and shame and a second-class status, but you also had freedom of religion and freedom of movement, freedom to run your own affairs, freedom to choose your own professions that were not reviled professions, freedom to live in most cases where you wished. In fact, we forget that Maimonides, for his famous statement about how life is the worst possible under Islam, was also a court physician in a Muslim court. So again, in 4 down, we find more ideas of ours. Remember, rhetoric and actions, theory and practice, we are our behavior, not our words. We can say wonderful things, but unless we do it, unless we live it, unless we act, that's what we really believe. That's what counts. Now, words can affect actions. They can influence them. They can inspire people. But in the end, what they choose to do is what they do, and that's how you can evaluate them. The second is that real life is always a compromise. Remember, the dhimmi survived for over 2,000 years in the case of the Babylonian Jewry of Baghdad. They were the longest Jewish diaspora community, almost 2,500 years until the 20th century. Now, they survived facing the psychological scars of scorn. And today, we see that real life is compromised. We know that real life is compromised. Our identity teaches us that real life is compromised. And the third principle we learn from this history of Jewish and Muslim relations is that the past is not automatically better than the present. And it certainly is not automatically a model for the present. There are those who would reestablish biblical law even in this country. They're called Reconstructionists, not Jews. There's a political movement called Reconstructionism that wants to take the Bible and make that the law of the land. Stoning and everything. Now, we understand that the past has many attributes to it, many positive characteristics, but plenty of things that modern life has progressed beyond. We can respect the past without living the past. And so if the dhimmi arrangement is unacceptable to our modern sensibilities, then it's not a model for today, as both of our speakers presented. Then we turned in the afternoon, 5 across on the next line, to Derek Pensler and the issue of Zionism and the Muslim world. And he spoke with great eloquence and with those marvelous pictures about the dangers of projection, of the battle between choosing Islamism or choosing Arab nationalism, and the unwise choices that were sometimes made by both the British and by the State of Israel. It's, again, a proof of the law of unintended consequences. As every parent knows, you make a rule, and it has unintended consequences. As every person who drives their car, everything you make, there's always unintended consequences. Sherman would always say, life is a compromise between good and bad, and you choose the most good. But there's always going to be some bad that comes along with it. The founding Zionists, again, fell into that trap of projection. They talked about the Arabs as a people, but not about Islam as a religion, as much as they should have. And when you see those images, those images that he showed were not done by Muslims. They were done by Jews and seen by Muslims and presented in the Muslim world to say, look what's happening. And again, this is that unintended effect. I agree with you. The Dome of the Rock is on every postcard. It's one of the visible symbols of Jerusalem, and I'm sure that was the sentiment. But there may have also been a subtlety to that. We've learned in the postmodern period in literary and cultural theory that there is a kind of Orientalism, colonialism to looking at the ancient world. As you said, it was a presence of absence, that the temple wasn't there. But there was something else there that was simply overlooked. And by putting the flag on top of it as if it was just the warehouse that was nearby, to put the flag up so everyone would see it, in the end, there's an implication to that too. It's subconscious. It's not a visual and a intentional, visceral desire to conquer this shrine that needs to be retaken so we can rebuild the temple. Not at all. But at the same time, it has its weaknesses and unintended consequences. So what advice can we bring to this part of the dialogue? Well, it's important to remember that the world is what is, not what we wish it to be. And that works in both directions, in our tradition too. We can say to the Muslim world, the world is what is. It's not what you want it to be. Israel is there. It's going to be there. But this applies to our tradition too. If you read in Deuteronomy these terrible passages that say, when you conquer the land, you will destroy the Canaanites and wipe out their cities and tear down their shrines and kill everyone, even the men, women, the children, and the animals, because the animals might lead you astray into idolatry. The one consolation is that it didn't happen. It was written by later generations who felt they had been led astray, when actually that's what they've always been doing, and it's the new thinking that's new. But they said, if only when we had conquered the land in our mythical history, we had wiped them out, and then we wouldn't have this problem. It's sort of wishful genocide. But it didn't happen. The world is what is, and not what we wish it to be, and so are we. And then we heard Yehuda Bauer, and it's appropriate that this is 6 down, because this was certainly a down. The first half. And he told us with these marvelous images of the elephant and the squirrel and the difference between religion and ethnicity in Islam and in the Jewish world. And of course, the extremists, even Jewish extremists, are politically engaged and perhaps into ethnic cleansing of pushing people out, but not into wiping out Muslims all over the world or to wiping out only the Muslim Palestinians and pushing them out and not touching the Christians. And in fact, out of Yehuda Bauer's speech, we have some clear messages. That radical Islam, which is to main Islam as the Aryan nations and Christian fundamentalism in the exclusionist, racist category, is to mainstream Christianity. Radical Islam wants to conquer the world. It uses the rhetoric of the Nazis. It plans to stop any participation in government because, of course, the God has given the law. And it's internationalist in the negative way, you see. Communism was international. Nazism was international. And so too, alas, is radical Islam. But the challenge is, of course, it's very tough to get beyond your own roots. I remember reading in Professor Girgis's book, Journey of the Jihadist, that there was a rivalry at one moment between the Egyptian members of Al-Qaeda and the Saudi Arabian members of Al-Qaeda. And I thought, well, if they can't even be internationalist in their 3,000-member band in a camp in Afghanistan, it's very hard to imagine going further beyond that. Now, the challenge with these radical Islamists is that they have two enemies, as, again, Professor Bauer said this morning. There's the Muslims who disagree with them, the liberal, progressive, or even the establishment Muslims in these countries. And then there's the West, whose spearhead are the Jews. And in, again, Fawaz Girgis's categories, the near enemy and the far enemy. The near enemy is the Muslim brother who is different, and the far enemy is Israel and the West. And the challenge is, of course, that now that we are there, the far enemy has come near. And as Girgis said, if not for logistics, we would be facing Afghanistan in Iraq. Now, this radical Islam is a small cancer at the moment, but it's spreading, paradoxically, as progressive Islam is spreading. You see, both of these trends are happening at opposite ends of the spectrum, and it remains to be seen where that undecided middle will land. It may be tending one way, it's not irrevocably committed in that direction. It's made desperate by modernization and confused, and the risk, of course, is that they will proceed towards utopia. And as we've heard, utopias kill, and universal utopias kill universally. So what lesson does our Judaism, our secular humanistic Judaism, provide? Well, it gives us the importance of incremental change, that the perfect is not the enemy of the good. I think you can have a good world. Not a perfect world, I agree. You never know when you're there, of course, because one person will be happy and another person will be upset, just like with the temperature in this room. Someone comes in early and they're cold. At the end of the program, they're hot. It's the same person. There's nothing I can do. I hear about it 3 times. But the perfect is not the enemy of the good. You can make progress. And secondly, we've learned through our own experience the dangers of an unrooted internationalism. It leads to utopias and their dangers. You can look at the Jewish experience. In Eastern Europe, for example, Jews were very much attracted by internationalist movements because they saw nationalism as excluding them, as this foreign body. And you would have meetings in rooms, and you can imagine 3 people. There would be one person standing up and saying, I am a Polish nationalist, and the other 2 would applaud. And the second person would stand up and say, I am a Ukrainian nationalist, and they would applaud. And the third would stand up and say, I am an internationalist, and the other 2 would say, ah, that's the Jew. We invented Esperanto as a universal language. Ludwig Zamenhof in Poland did it. There's a street named after him in his hometown. And yet after every Esperanto conference, they would break down and have their private conversations in Yiddish. Because that's where they came from. So I found a great line a few years ago. We would love it if all national barriers would break down, all divisive religious identities would fade, and everyone could be part of one beautiful humanity. We'll go 12th. Because we've always gone first and no one has followed. So now we'll go 12th. Now, this morning, we heard a marvelously articulate voice from the Muslim world, living in the Muslim world and working to change the Muslim world, Amir Hussein. There's something new about the Muslim experience in diaspora, and it is a diaspora. It's in fact a diaspora, not a melting pot, but a mixing bowl, because you have people together who geographically would never have been together trying to find a way to run a mosque, and then to split a mosque, and then to reform a mosque. Is it going to be, in fact, a success? Is it going to blend between the communities? That timeline is not projectable. You know, you would have guessed in the Jewish world that the Litvaks and the Galicianers would have never gotten along. But I'm sure there's a number of people in the room who have no idea who a Litvak is and what a Galicianer was. And that's certainly the case going forward. Now, the other challenge that we found in the Muslim experience in diaspora is the breaking down of barriers on a very personal level. In college, I was roommates on the same floor with a secular Pakistani Muslim. His name was Suhab. I won't tell you where his ring was. But the challenge with Suhab was that on one hand, he was a secular Muslim. He was active in the Student Labor Action Coalition, the labor activist group on campus. He was sort of the representative person of color, actually, because they were all Jews. But they really wanted him at every meeting, because otherwise they felt really guilty. Well, it's hard to stick it to the man when you are the man. Now, what I loved about Suhab was that he was at once a secular person, but connected to his personal identity. He would tell me stories of when his father worked in Saudi Arabia, and he would be there during Ramadan, in summer Ramadan, not a winter Ramadan, where the days are long, and there's no food and no water all day for a month. And people have to work. It's not like they're sitting in shul all day. They have to go and do their normal routine. And he would see the Saudi elite driving around in air-conditioned limos, and the day laborers schlepping, they didn't use the word schlepping, hauling heavy loads in the sun all day. In fact, one of the theories about why violence sometimes spikes during Ramadan is that people have short tempers. They're hungry, they're thirsty, they're mad. But he fasted for Ramadan as a secular Muslim. He didn't have a lot of fat to spare, but he did it because of his identification with this tradition. And also because for him the meaning of the fast for Ramadan was not because it was commanded, but because it's sympathy for the poor that fast every day, that can't afford a lunch. You know, we think we're really magnanimous fasting for 26 hours. Fasting for a month is a big deal. And I learned from him, that's the point. We were in the same floor all the time, speaking to each other at almost every hour of the night, as you can imagine in college. And it was marvelous. I learned tremendously. If nothing else, he introduced me to a wonderful new writer of whom I'd heard but I'd never bothered to read. His name is Salman Rushdie. You may have heard of him. You may have heard that he shared the stage with Sherwin at this conference in Boston this past spring. And Salman Rushdie has written a number of books, very famous ones, of course, but Suhab told me about one of his best. It's called Shame. And I thought it was a Jewish book by the title. But it isn't. It's about a man and his loves, and it's about the author, and it's about this identity of living between worlds. And it was fabulous. I never would have heard of it. I never would have picked it up without this contact. And now it's an entree into this world I never would have had before. And Professor Hussein also spoke very ably and eloquently and inspirationally about his activities and the activities of progressive Muslims in this country. People say, where are the voices? There are the voices. The challenge is that they aren't the sexy voices you see on CNN. It's a little bit like my challenge as a humanistic rabbi to get on the news. Why? I don't look like a rabbi. Because a chassid, even the least educated chassid, looks like a rabbi. The news thinks they're all rabbis. But it's not true. Of course, Sivan, or Rabbi Colton at the Birmingham Temple, or any of the other women rabbis that have been ordained by, they are fully rabbis too. In fact, over 50% of the rabbis being trained at the Jewish Theological Seminary and the Hebrew Union College are women. That's what a rabbi looks like. But it's hard to change those impressions. So the same thing is true in the Muslim world and getting those progressive voices out. That's not what Muslims sound like. They sound like what we think they sound like. and you compare his Islam and his vision and his rhetoric to radical Islam on the other end, or even what you think is mainstream Islam, and you can see a bright light that's shining. Whether people will follow it is what remains to be seen. So what can we learn? What can we provide to this kind of a dialogue? What inspiration can we give? Well, we share a very important value, and that is, it was in the service that we read on Friday. We are all human. We all share the same needs and desires. We can share the same music. We can share the same appreciation of art, even if our particular traditions have been artistic differently. We can hear the minority voices. You see, we seek the truth. We want the truth. Not the truth as the media presents it, or the truth as we think we know it, but the truth from the people that are there. The truth as best we can hear it. And after all, who are we to not listen to minority voices? Who are we to ignore the apikorsim of today in the Muslim world, who are moving forward toward a future which we would like to see? And then from Yehuda Bauer again, always a treat and a pleasure. He spoke about the importance of not simply being tolerated. I mean, how would you like to be tolerated at the workplace? That's no fun. That's not satisfying. That doesn't give you any sense of self-worth. You want respect, and that's our objective. He talked about making friends on the local level, but he also talked about making coalitions. Political coalitions, but also coalitions on the ordinary level. And Amir Hussein talked about this as well. We have to make what Sherwin used to call the horizontal alliances. You know, we think of ourselves in vertical columns, like separate buildings. Judaism, Christianity, Islam. But sometimes the commonalities are much greater this way than they are this way. I have much more in common with a Unitarian minister than I do with a Hasidic rabbi. In worldview, in openness to discussion of alternatives, in the acceptance of each other as alternative ways to understand the world, in our tolerance for the beliefs of others. I mean, we have a lot more in common. You know, in Israel, you have a battle against religion because you have religious authorities that have control. And you have to fight them to create a secular space for weddings and for the celebrations of life and for the creation of meaningful community. In the United States, it's as much a battle within religions. You know, we hear about the evolution and creationist debate in this country. That's not a debate between religion and science. That's a debate between religion and religion. Because there is a massive religious organization in this country that supports both biblical criticism and the evolutionary origins of the Torah and this theory of evolution. It's called the Catholic Church. Their official doctrine supports evolution and supports the gradual evolution of the Torah text through the documentary hypothesis and archaeology and all of the other information that we can find. Now, if that's the issue we're fighting, I have no problem working with someone from the Catholic Church because we have a clear issue that we're sharing and we're moving forward on that. We have to make those horizontal alliances where it's appropriate and not get stuck into our vertical boxes, because then, of course, we end up boxed in this little corner like this. So we have a lot to add to this dialogue. We can say, most importantly, that we believe in the importance of the freedom of choice, of people running their own lives and deciding for themselves what meaning is, what identity is, and what truth is. We focus on what we can know and what we can do in the world and what we can do in our own homes and communities. We believe that words have meaning. You say what you believe what you say, and you challenge the wording that doesn't agree with you. You have the courage to choose from your inheritance. You have the courage to say, I like this, I don't like this, but it's all mine. We believe that rhetoric and theory are less important than deeds and practice, that real life is a matter of compromise. The past is not automatically a model for the present. The world is what is, not what we wish it to be. And incremental change can move us toward the good. After all, we have a lot to add to this dialogue. It's not a matter of how many times a day that you pray, or what you eat or don't eat, or how you treat a certain book. The rest of these pieces, the last little holes in this puzzle, are yet to be found, and there will always be a few blanks. But I want to share with you just a few closing thoughts on more pieces that we can add to this puzzle. When I first spoke with Amir Hussein on the phone, we had the opportunity to discuss the situation of the modern Muslim diaspora in the Western world, and in many ways we agreed it has amazing parallels to that early period in the 19th century of Reform Judaism that Professor Lassner in a comment alluded to. The creation of new seminaries, perhaps, but certainly new versions of an old identity. If you look at the experience of Reform, by the way, it was not smooth. Those early Reform rabbis were excoriated in the Jewish press and in the Jewish community. In some cases, they were excommunicated or expelled from their positions. It found fertile ground in America. It struggled in Europe for many, many years. In many ways, there are a tremendous number of similarities between this model of exploration, the creation of social service agencies, the creation of alternative women's organizations, the creation of alternative mosques. As there are 35 mosques in Toronto, my guess is there's a spectrum. Now, it may not have divided in a clear way that you can see in the Detroit Jewish News of all the denominations, but there's clearly a spectrum. And as the spectrum coalesces into clumps, you may find exactly that kind of denominationalism. I sometimes refer to that as the joy of sects. CTS. The joy of sects. And the advantage of that, of course, is that when you have all of these different varieties under one umbrella, it can lead to a kind of toleration. And more than toleration, more than a plurality, it may even lead to a kind of pluralism. Those in this community know the Birmingham Temple 30 years ago was synagoga non grata in the Jewish community. They couldn't get listed in the paper. They couldn't get weddings done by Sherwin listed as announcements. It simply was not recognized and ignored. But today, we're there, we're involved, we're part of the community. We had to bull our way in, but we're there. And the Jewish community has become more pluralistic. When I was here, I got calls from Reform rabbis who weren't able to do weddings, or even were unwilling to do a wedding, but knew that I would do it, who called me. That's pluralism. That's saying their fit isn't right for me, but they might be right for you. That experience of diversity of multiple denominations will be the inheritance of the Muslim world as well, at least in the diaspora. The question, of course, is transplanting it back. And as we know, the soil may be different. It may be harsher, it may be more traditionalist, but we also know that that reaction that created modern Orthodox Judaism as well led in the end to even more diversity, because there was a middle ground of conservative between Orthodox and Reform. And then conservative morphed into Reconstructionism, and Reform in the secular Jewish world morphed into secular humanistic Judaism, and who knows what will morph into the future. Now we have a second gift that we can give. It goes back to something that Professor Yaakov Malkin said at a previous colloquium. When talking about the Bible and this argument of is the Bible the core of Jewish identity, he talked about a concept that the current facilitator didn't like, but I thought was interesting. It was the concept of poetic truth. There's a time when a story has a resonance in you, even if you don't agree with it. And you can think of the marvelous Yiddish story, Three Gifts, by Yud Lamed Peretz, where it tells stories of Jewish martyrdom. From a modern perspective, a man is going to heaven, and he's getting evaluated whether he can get in, and he's told to find 3 gifts to decide his worth. And he finds these 3 stories of martyrdom for the faith, and the angel looks at them and says, these 3 are very beautiful, totally worthless, but very beautiful. How does a secular person appreciate martyrdom? It feels like a mistake, and yet there's some beauty to it. There's a poetic truth to the past that gives it dignity without giving it literal reality. Now, that's one of the arguments that the Muslim world will have to have. Of, is there a way to integrate the kind of critical scholarship that the outside world has produced into the internal process? You know, in the Jewish world, biblical criticism was rejected. It was called not higher criticism, but higher anti-Semitism, because it was thought to be attacking the core of what it meant to be Jewish. And you will have this reaction as well when critical theories begin to enter mainstream Islamic discourse and even practice. But it's a necessary transition that has to happen. And the last. You see, there was a misnomer in the title. It said, solving the puzzle. There's not one puzzle. There's many puzzles. I mean, just look at those fault lines. Look at all the issues that we've raised, all of the historical and current and future issues that we face. You know, the process of moving forward is not only creation. There is sometimes destruction. When a building falls down, it doesn't fall all the way down. You have to knock the rest down and clear it out and dig something out, and then you can build with a new foundation. When you challenge traditional faith, there is a period of knocking down. But there is also a period of building up, of creating positive meaning that doesn't involve destroying. It doesn't involve breaking down structure. It involves constructing, building, combining, and growing. And perhaps Jewish-Muslim relations needed to be broken down. The dhimmi arrangement is not acceptable. We needed an end to the dhimmi. We need to rebuild. Once we can clear the brush and clear the rubble of the dhimmi, this sense of Muslim power and Jewish weakness, perhaps we can rebuild on a new foundation of tolerance, and even better than tolerance, ultimately respect. And this is the last lesson that Sherwin has to give to this colloquium. One of his best lines ever, the one that exemplifies how he lived his life. Dignity is the search for respect, not agreement. What we seek in Jewish and Muslim relations is not toleration. It's not even agreement. We will agree to disagree on many issues. But if we start with the premise of dignity, a dignity based on respect, then that foundation has roots that will not shake. On behalf of all of our Colloquium Committee and the event that we have held, I want to thank all of you for your attendance and your participation, your enthusiasm. Your stamina has been fabulous, and I will no longer stand between you and the food and the books. So I thank you very much.